Before you can understand the present, you must first understand the past.
Now, last Sunday marked the 175th National Commemoration of the Famine, which was held in Milford. We had President Michael D. Higgins and Minister Jack Chambers and our own Cathaoirleach Liam Blaney in attendance, and good time now for us to discuss the famine. Before I get into it, I'm going to start with a big one here. We talk about it...
Easy on.
Yeah, no, but we call it a famine, right? Yeah. And you know, we have a modern sense of what a famine is. A famine is, and a description of it. It's where crops fail. It's where, you know, there's nothing to eat. There's no rain. There's no growth in the land. But there was food in Ireland, and that food was taken from the Irish and exported. I'm not sure, and you can tell me to a point whereby that was one of the main reasons why people were starving. But was it, how do you define it, Joe, with your background?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and maybe with the way we're going with Ireland and the peace process is probably a very politically sensitive matter as well. And it's very interesting that Tony Blair, 25 years ago, during the Good Friday Agreement, when things were trying to be bedded down, apologised to the nation of Ireland for the neglect of the famine by the British government. See, one needs to remember that in 1801, the Act of Union, so the famine was 1840, the worst year was 1847. So some 4 decades after the Act of Union, when we lost our own government, we were really British in that sense. So it was a British famine as opposed to an Irish famine. And we didn't have a government. And so we were controlled by Westminster. And they did some very positive things, but not enough. And I think the famine, the policy that England had, led to our famine to some degree. And what people maybe don't understand is that England had gone through an industrial revolution, and there was an urbanisation of England. And the policy in England then by Westminster was that Ireland would become the breadbasket for England to feed it with its agriculture. So Ireland wasn't to be developed with industry. And in that way, we were hamstrung by British policy, which was to their own benefit and not to ours. And so there is that question. And Cecil Woodham Smith, she wrote a book, and she actually had said that she was one of the first, that it wasn't a famine, that it was actually a genocide, that it was neglect by the British government because they controlled us in their policies that led us to our...
and do you agree, or does the truth lie somewhere in between that claim and what we would know as a famine?
Well, it's very easy to judge again from sitting back here from the perspective of history and having more knowledge and understanding of how it played out. But the reality is that they did do things. They did import grain. That was Peel's brimstone. Peel was the Prime Minister. And then during the middle of the famine, Lord Russell, he became the Prime Minister. He did bring in public works, building bridges, piers, roads. Many of those piers and roads are here in Donegal today that we use. They also set up soup kitchens. But their attitude was that you shouldn't get free food without having to give labour.
Okay, and we'll get on to that, because that's where the workhouses come from. Yeah. And I'm interested in your assessment on that. But just finally, on how we phrase it and how we view it, have we had, or do we need a national conversation or something convened where we settle on that part of our history, even if that is politically controversial?
That'll be a very interesting question. I would be more interested in settling on what has the effect of the famine been on us, on our soul, on our psyche, on our understanding, and who we are. Like I remember a number of people, but one woman, for example, from Famine down in Kinalaw, it was known as Nellie Veck, and her parents were alive during the famine. So my memory of the famine is within one generation of someone knowing people that grew up on the famine, and we're all about 5 or 6 generations in real terms away from the famine. Historically, 175 years ago now, saying that someone is 50, that means it's 125 years away. In that sense, it is not, 150 years away. It is not a very long distance historically, but it has impacted on our soul. And back to the thing, and I have to be very careful about England. Daniel O'Connell wanted Home Rule, and one of his biggest opponents was Isaac Butt, who was a Norwich man, who was a Protestant, who was of landed gentry, and who was totally opposed to him. And Daniel O'Connell said to him, someday you're going to jump across to my side and you will be arguing for Home Rule. And actually, he did. Isaac Butt, who became the father of Irish nationalism and Home Rule, he changed his mind after the famine. As an Orangeman, as a Protestant, he realised that England were interfering in the normal economics and social development of Ireland, and he realised that we needed our own government. And this is back maybe to understanding our history and how England will always serve its own interests first, and we have always suffered because of that. And so when you talk about the famine and do we need to have a conversation, I think we need to talk about our own self-worth and our own self-understanding of what happened to us. The impact on the famine in Ireland, right away, 1 million people died, 1 million people left the country. The Irish language was the beginning of the decay or the decline of the Irish language. It was the beginning of a lot of diaspora, a lot of effects of the famine. But here's what it really did. It robbed us of our poets or fiddlers or shanachie. It robbed us of the cleaned out lots of the older generation.
Do you know what that reminds me a little bit of? I was in, and it's completely different, and I'm not equating this with anything, but just in terms of how culturally you can lose so much. I was in I can't remember which one it was, a German city. Knock were doing flights to it or whatever. I went over there, and just speaking to tour guides and talking to people, and because of Nazi Germany. And because of wanting to forget the past, and this is for different reasons, of course, anything that was even remotely associated with or could be Nazi Germany was wiped, be it architecture, but also songs, pieces of music, writings, drawings, nothing, tons and tons of stuff that wasn't actually directly to do with Nazi Germany or Hitler in itself. A massive swathe of 2 or 3 generations of art and culture or what have you gone, and it's kind of, and there is some attempts to try and weed all that out and bring some of it past, but it was erased from German history for understandable reasons, and the same happened here from a different reason because of a natural disaster. How much was lost?
Oh, I think it's going to take us, and I've said this before, we've had 800 years of colonialism, and at the end of that period of colonialism, we had a famine that basically wiped out the natural people that would pass on tradition in Latin, traditio, to hand on. So the language, the music, the folklore, all these people that had died, those people that would have all that story, all that history, we were... When we came out of the famine, we were battered and bruised psychologically, socially, spiritually, and it played a big lot on our soul and our psyche, so much so that I think that, our housing crisis today and different issues that we have today, everybody wants to own their house because somewhere in our psyche we didn't have. People are very generous in Ireland. We'd never want to see anybody without, and we're very generous for trocra and collections, and when we hear of famines in other countries, because we know deep down in our own psyche we were once that downtrodden, broken people.
So whether we're aware of it, like we don't know have the awareness, we can't help but that is what's been handed down in the only 2, 3, 4, 5 short generations past. That hangover, that shadow, still affects us, even if we don't have the awareness to understand that might be why we are the way we are in certain ways.
And I think that's got to do with part of our lack of confidence in ourselves, lack of belief in ourselves. And, the politicians of that time let us down, and we knew that. And maybe we're still like that, thinking like that politicians should have let us down, where we should be expecting higher standards from those that are appointed to make our country a better country. And that's not a criticism at anybody.
No, it's a conversation on the people. It's not. I know you're not referencing the politicians, but look, the time is just going to go so quick. So I just presumably there'd been failures of potato in the past. Did they lead to famine, death, disease previously? Obviously not on the 1847 scale, that being the worst year, but it must have happened in the past, of course.
Yes, famine was regular in Ireland. I mean, in my own parish in 1839, there was a severe famine, and the priest in Gweedore, for example, Father Doherty, had written about this famine that 9/10 of the population were starving. Famines were regular. There were a number of famines in 1850. And in fact, I would argue as a historian, the 1880 famine that was in Donegal was possibly worse than the 1847 famine. So when we think of the famine, we think of it nationally. But for example, during that time in the 1880s, 34,000 people in Donegal were on food lists. There was such a bad famine in 1880, but maybe that's for another day talking. So famines were a regular occurrence. And see, what basically happened was, with an industrialisation of England and the need for more food, etc., Ireland had a system of subdividing the land, and the population was growing, about 1 million every 10 years. That's an amazing growth rate in the 1800s. So when we get to the famine, Irish population is growing 1 million every 10 years. And this is down to the simple potato, the lumper. You didn't need a lot of land, and you could produce a lot of spuds and feed your family. And what people maybe don't realise, the spud itself is a superfood. It's an amazing fruit. It is more potassium than a banana. I mean, if you lived on a diet of spuds, you will be actually very, very healthy. It prevents cancer. It helps strengthen bones. It relieves stress. It has vitamin C, vitamin B6. It has sodium, to help you keep you from cholesterol. It's cholesterol free, and it's an amazing food. So this superfood was the diet for they estimate about 4.5 million people in Ireland at that time. And so when the Blight came in 1846, they didn't have this fallback food. This was what they were living on. The Blight hit other parts of Europe as well, but they were not as dependent on the potato.
They diversified to some extent, whereas we were very reliant upon it.
And that led then just basically to the perfect storm. So how now were we going to feed ourselves? And the reality is that food, and this is what various historians have proven and shown, wheat and corn were still being exported from Ireland during the famine. It's hard to believe that, but food was exported from Ireland during the famine.
But who was making that decision? Because someone had to make a decision, because every action has a reaction. There's consequences for all the action. Someone or a group of people must have said, we are taking this food and it will lead to the starvation and death of hundreds of thousands of people, and it ended up being in the millions, not to mention forcing us to scatter around the world to try and seek out some. And I think sometimes we need to remember that element of our history, that we fled this country and we landed in other countries with nothing. And we weren't safe at home. We were landed in countries at nothing, and to a great extent, the doors were opened for us, and we were allowed to make lives there. And we celebrate that now as a part of our history. But maybe all the roads come back to you not wanting to criticise the English, and if that's the case, I get that, right? But we were thrown under the bus to some extent. Someone had to decide to say, right, we are going to continue to make the money from exporting this food from Ireland, and that means people will starve as a result.
Well, you see, it was the kind of the prevalent economic philosophy at the time, not just in England, but in France and in other parts of Europe. It was called laissez-faire, laissez-aller. In other words, let things be the way they are, and water kind of finds its own level. So if there's poverty, leave it the way it is, and people will have to work their way out of poverty. If there's people making money, leave it the way it is and let them make money. I mean, if you go back into the 80s with Margaret Thatcher, she talked about there's no such thing as society. It was only the individual, and you must support the individual to become very wealthy. She broke the unions. So that was a philosophy that people had, that if you were poor, if you were hungry, it was your own fault.
Well, Joe, are you up to your ears, or can you come back after 11 for 10 minutes? Before I go, why did we not grow carrots and turnips and catch fish and eat that? And I'm not being facetious, right? But, our lakes and rivers and seas are plentiful. There is, could we not have grown other root vegetables, and eaten fish or meat?
Well, there's a few answers to that. Number one is those other foods wouldn't have given you what the spud would have given you to feed your family. That's the first thing. Secondly was farm husbandry, your farming methods. They wouldn't have had the knowledge or the technology or the know-how and the availability for them. It wasn't what they were used to. And when you mention fishing, like the population in Tory Island and Donegal increased during the famine because they had fish, and that probably sustained them.
I get you. It was like a lifeboat, effectively, then.
Yeah, but most people in Donegal didn't know how to fish, didn't have boats to fish.
I get you.
So, I mean, asking them to fish when they didn't know how to, or didn't have the equipment to fish and didn't have boats. So therefore, you know, there was that problem of how do you transfer from being dependent on a potato to other types of food.
Let's talk about landlords in Donegal. How did they respond to the appearance of the famine?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And maybe to set it in context, when England were looking at they realised that there was a serious problem in Ireland, and they set up a commission, a poor investigation committee in 1838. And they did his report and found that there was about 2.5 million people on the poverty line all the time with a want of food. And they said, well, how are we going to address this? We have a problem in Ireland. And so the solution was, they suggested, first of all, not to use the English system of poor law, the workhouse system in England, that this wouldn't work in Ireland. But the government in England at the time didn't want to hear this. And they said, no, we're going to extend what we have in England into Ireland. It fits in England, so it fits in Ireland. And it was totally inappropriate. And so what they did is they set up workhouses throughout the whole of Ireland, about 130. And there was 8 unions here in Donegal, like Milford, where we had the commemoration there at the weekend, and Dunfanaghy and different Glenties and different places like that. And they said that will be the system by which we will alleviate the poverty. The problem with this was that local people had to pay for the upkeep of those houses. So the poor people in these areas had to pay for the poor people in these places. And the way they worked it out was that if you had a farm worth £4, you must pay rates. And those rates, that tax, would go to the maintenance of the workhouses. So that was the philosophy. But if your farm wasn't over £4, valued £4, then you didn't have to pay rates. Well, in the case of, for example, in Falcarra, £4 in those times was 960 old pence. The average holding in Falcarra and Cloughaneely was about 400 pence. So they were halfways, way below halfways of the poverty line. And Gweedore was even worse. Their farms were worth about 240 pence. Now, the poverty line was 960 pence. So most people were so poor that they couldn't pay for these rates. So the thing was then it was left to the landlords to pay. Mm-hmm. And this is where the problem arose. So if a landlord had a busy workhouse, he was having to pay for it. So the moral of the story was you need to evict the people, get them out of your land, get them away from you because you don't want to have to pay for them. And so what happened during the famine, because of the poor law system, many people, upwards of 1 million people, were evicted in Ireland because of the bureaucracy of the British poor law system. And rather than helped us, it actually exasperated and made worse the situation for the ordinary.
I mean, we have another situation where a government makes a policy that impacts the poorest most.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So how then could those people find their way to a workhouse to feed themselves?
Well, the problem was when you went to the workhouse, you had to give up your farm and you never got back to it again. So the landlord took possession of your farm. So now you were without a home and without land. So your choice was either to die or to emigrate. And you mentioned something very wonderful there about our own history in emigration. When people come back, immigrants come back, you know what they stand for me? And we have statues to remind us of the famine and national commemoration statues and all the rest. But when I see someone come home from abroad, they remind me of the famine because they were the people that had to leave, and they have the memory of the famine maybe greater than us because they know why they are where they are. Partially, many people had left before the famine.
Well,
for
listen,
the famine.
And as you say earlier on, we've been conditioned, or because of our recent history, in how we are generous and we're welcoming and opening, and also that sense to, at a certain age, it seems, either by choice or necessity, to travel the world and try and better yourself. Those seeds were planted around famine time as well. How many people can we estimate died in Donegal as the result of the famine? Our population now, say, for instance, is around about 163, 64. It's probably actually close to 170,000 now with new residents. But do we know what the population of Donegal was at famine times? And do we have a number as to how many passed away?
Yeah, well, the population of Donegal would have been a lot higher then. They reckon in Ulster, and we remember a lot of, as in Belfast, more urban areas didn't have the same famine results as we had as in deaths. They estimate in Ulster about 111,000 people died during the famine. And in Donegal, it's somewhere in the region of 13,000 people. 13,000 people. And in 1847 alone, that number was 5,000. So 5,000 of the people of Donegal died, and the population would have been a lot higher then than it is now. It would have been probably about 240, 250,000, wow. I'd imagine, at that time. So, over a period, say, from 45 to 51, somewhere in that region, about 40,000 Irish Donegal people either left or died.
How much higher might that be without the workhouses?
I don't think the workhouses achieved a terrible lot. See, the problem with the workhouses...
Well, people were able to feed themselves, though. I mean, you talked what there was it 14 or how many did you say was in Donegal? But in any case...
14,000 died in Donegal during the famine.
But in terms of the workhouses, people were able to work and to feed themselves. Surely that would it not have prevented further...
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, again, there's a number of historians have done research and published books about the workhouses. And just from my own understanding and listening to, for example, the priest that wrote at that time, a lot of the people didn't want to go to the workhouses because they were very harsh. People weren't very well fed there. The workhouses were overstressed. They had maybe 3 times the capacity that they were built for. And the landlords that were paying for these workhouses and to feed them didn't want too much money spent. So a lot of people actually died in the workhouses. Yeah. And what happened in the workhouses as well was fever came into the workhouses and it killed a lot of people. So people were afraid to go to the workhouse in case, first of all, the malnutrition and then fever. And what maybe people don't understand is fever killed more people than actually starvation. What happened was obviously your immune system's down because of the lack of food, because of malnutrition, but then the fever gets in easily enough and it killed loads of people in Donegal. Fever killed people more than hunger itself. Mm-hmm. And so what people didn't want to go to the workhouse, and what actually did happen was people built little turf huts outside their own homes and they fed people with fever on a shovel. And you either lived and survived or you died and you were buried. Wow. But they didn't have them in the house and hoping that the fever would pass. And that's the way they would treat them. And there's a lovely story told about down in the folklore collection of 1947 on the 100th anniversary of the famine. They sent people out to gather folklore of the living memory. And there's one story told by a woman down there in the Manchera, that's there in Crawley, down beside Tessie's and Leo's down that direction. And she talked about how people... when the fever got into the house, nobody went and visited their house. Reminds me a wee bit of COVID. Nobody would go and visit. Yeah. And one by one, people died. And what happened then, she described how hungry dogs went round and they ate some of these remains. And then when people came back to themselves, she said, they went and they burned their houses because of the disease and the bacteria or the whatever disease would be in that. So rather than go into the house, they burned the houses. Mm-hmm. They gathered the bodies, the remains, the bones, and buried them and burned the houses. So look, it was a horrific vista when you think in it like that. And the suffering. It was.
I want you to define, because we have obviously some of the workhouses have been knocked down. Some remain pretty much intact, and we know the sites of the others. What do they stand for in our history? In other words, what should, if we were to put something to commemorate on that site, is it death and disease and hardship? Or if I asked you to go into Donegal town now and define that workhouse and how we should treat it in our history, how would you do it?
Look, we can't change our past. And I think we need to be very aware of it and understand it and be very much tied into the emotion of what happened, and to be very, very cognizant of just the pain, the suffering, the loss and all that. But you know what? You see, this is where you have to have hope. That should be a transformative experience and make us better human beings. And I think the Irish people, strangely, we are better people because of our famine. We are more generous and kind and welcoming and understanding and friendly. We know what loss is. We know what suffering is. And if I were to put in any kind of symbol, I think of the children of Lir that were converted into swans. It's a famous mythological story. And like set free, so to speak. In a way, we need to liberate ourselves from this. And it's going to take us about 200 or 300 years to move on from the psychological.
But that's why I talked about us having a national conversation, because I think sometimes you can only move forward when you actually determine where you're at and you settle on a history, and then you can say, right, from here we go forward. And you know, and a happy birthday to a lady, Ireland's oldest person, 109. She celebrated her birthday this year. Her mother or father would only have to have been 85 for them to be able to tell that lady who's living right now what it was like to live through the famine. It came to my mind to articulate how recent this is to us. The oldest lady in Ireland, her mum or dad would only have to be 75 to have been 10 through the worst of the famine. Just very finally, a caller says that their impression is that the famine is regarded as a Southern Ireland issue, and they believe there's very little about the famine in Northern Ireland. You've already referenced we do have figures across Ulster. 111,000 people died by the famine, but is there something to what the listener says? Is that slightly complicated because of the political makeup of Northern Ireland as well, and how we're struggling maybe to discuss it? It's even more complicated maybe for elements of the community in Northern Ireland.
Well, first of all, the potato blight didn't work because you were Catholic or Protestant. It crossed everybody. Yeah. But the farm husbandry of planters were always far more advanced than us. That's just a historical reality. They planted hedges. They had fruit, apples and pears. They knew this. They were very, very organised, very clean, very good farm husbandry. We didn't have that. And we didn't have the knowledge that they had. But having said that, and this is very, very important, it's very easy to point the finger and blame the landlords. There were a lot of good landlords. Hamilton in Donegal town, he was a recklessly generous landlord. He spent all his money. Alford and Ballyconnell and Fulcara and Hill, they spent about £4,000 of their own money feeding people. There were a lot of good landlords. And as regards Northern Ireland, the London Dairy Ladies Association, they were workwomen in London Dairy Association in Derry. They raised money and sent it into Donegal. For example, they sent £15 to the people of Buncrana. And that would have been a lot of money back then. The Quakers, the Society of Friends, they brought in, I think it was about 1920 big soup boilers into Donegal. To feed the people of Donegal. The Cabrys and the Bournevilles, they were very generous, and they were motivated by their religion and their sense of common humanity. So one has to be very careful when one is talking about this, not to be pointing and blaming. Yeah. There were policy deficiencies, but you know what? There were also brilliant people that stood up and did what they could. Even for example, Catholic priests, not many, but a number of them here in Donegal, some of them got the fever themselves when they were out visiting the people, and some of them died. They weren't immune to this either. So, there's that whole side of it as well.
And I think too, if you don't mind me saying, and you can associate yourself with these comments or otherwise, in that we started this conversation talking about the famine and the fact that food was taken from this country that perhaps could have helped to sustain the population. We should reflect on that, I think, as a nation, when we have hundreds of thousands of children living in poverty, 200,000, when we have so many people accessing food banks. We know the food banks across Donegal are under pressure at the moment. The shelves are running dry, and there are in the high hundreds families who are now regularly having to go to food banks to feed themselves. Before maybe sometimes we look back at history and go, oh, look what the Brits did to us. Maybe we should say that should be a reminder to ensure in a country that we're reminded constantly of how wealthy it is, that we're kind of guilty of doing that to our own people right now, Joe.
I agree with you. And again, I think it's back to maybe our own psyche that we expect so little from people in leadership. We expect so little from people that are in charge of us, and we think that, they're not listening or they don't have to be accountable to us. And that's maybe our fault. We need to start believing in ourselves and say, no, we deserve better. We have a right to have better. And just maybe to put it in a context worldwide, if I'd been talking to you, say, 10 years ago, I'd have been saying to you 80 individuals fit into a double-decker bus had more money than half the population. Now it's down to 8. 8 wealthy men have more money than half the population of the world, while people are starving and hunger and poverty and war. I don't know how those people can live with their conscience.
No, I don't know how. I don't know how, and set themselves up as heroes too in some regards. And also, we as a people, I believe, really need to hit the reset button and start being together, because we are allowing ourselves to be divided. So you'll have people who are working going, oh, look at them people on social welfare, they should be doing this, that and the other. We have others going, look at why should we have these people homeless and these people are coming in and taking this, that and the other. And it works. If you're in the political elite and you want to keep the status quo, it's perfect, because you've got the population arguing amongst each other and split and divided. We the people need to start pulling together, because if you talk about holding a government to account, whichever government that might be, a divided people will never do that, because they're arguing over what the government is doing wrong. You know what I mean? And I think people need to start focusing on what unites them more than what's divided them. And we need to get that sense of community, that Irish community back, that now you have to go to Dubai or London or New York or Brisbane to see. And it's there alive and well, Joe. That sense of community is there still, but it's being lost in this country, and it's getting worse all the time.
Well, I think I've had this debate with you before. I'm going back to the famine. We were ruled from Westminster. It was an Irish famine for Irish people to solve, even though we didn't have the government that was supposedly our government allowing us to do anything about it. And if you look, just for example, last week alone, in our own government, they brought in, for example, they're questioning our neutrality. They've put in under the back door, people aren't aware of it, a new sex ed program that's just horrific. They're bringing in new, the speech law I talked to you before, hate speech. They're bringing in all these laws by an agenda from the top. And at the bottom, the everyday Joe soap, who's talking about electricity prices? Who's talking about food prices? Who's fighting for the real issues that matter? It's not been done from the top.
No, but you see, I don't agree with everything that you've said there. In terms of my views and yours might differentiate on a couple of those issues, but that's fine. That doesn't matter. That we and you can have a chat and sort it out, and you might change my views, and God forbid I might even change yours if we did. But my point is you see, then when you get down to it, right, people, we don't just let's have a debate on hate speech. What happens is then it's hate speech so that you can't criticise trans people, or it's hate speech that you can't criticise migrants, right? That's not what it's all about. And as soon as we start daisy chaining the issues, the debate disappears, because it's piggybacked and it's hijacked. No, I'm not saying it's not relevant to those issues, right? But it's perfect, because you have the population arguing not about hate speech. They start arguing about trans rights or immigration or migration, and the government is sitting there going, well, look, we can just introduce this because these people haven't a clue what they're on about. So we need to start talking about issues. Yes, we can use examples, but I think when we start grouping a number of issues in together, then it becomes liberalism versus being conservative, and we just end up in this endless loop and cycle, and we get nowhere. And all the while, the big boys can do whatever they like, Joe.
Well, I mean, the political elite are running the world. Just talk about the wealthy people. Why is there not a worldwide wealth tax? They talk about, they can come together for COP and for environmental and climate change. Can they not come together and introduce a wealth tax worldwide? These billionaires that are making such money, and nothing's been done about it because it doesn't suit
the people. We have the world's richest man in Elon Musk, who I actually don't have a problem with. He is lauded by the people who have nothing as the saviour. Not only that, they give him €8 a month for the pleasure, right, of listening to his words. Humanity, what hope is there when the richest man in the world is seen as a hero to the poor? And people don't.
Elon Musk, he's challenging the status quo.
To whose benefit? He's driving traffic. He's driving traffic to save his 44 billion. And he might frame it up as being free speech. It's not. How can free speech cost €8 a month, Joe? Don't tell me you're drinking that Kool-Aid.
No, I'm sorry, I don't spend the €8 on it.
Listen, come here.
My children, be looking for money for Xboxes and top-ups on the computer games. And I say to them, where's this money going? It's going into some very wealthy...
come here, let them enjoy the Xbox. All right, come here, I have to go.
But listen, back to the famine.
Briefly,
to say that, look, as a nation, we have to have that conversation, as you mentioned, and we have to think a lot more about it. There's a lot of sad stories there, but there's also a lot of hope if we think about it in a positive way and how we're a better people for it. And finally, just to mention that one of the areas that were most hit by the famine, and there's a lovely book called The Outer Edge of Ulster, edited by Professor Brenton McSivney, called The Outer Edge of Ulster, and it describes what happened in Fannet during the famine, how it basically went from 10,000 people down to 3,000 or 4,000 people, and how the whole social fabric of Fannet was kind of fell apart because of it. And just to say that I was at Fannet the weekend, a big shout out to Anya Peter McConaughey, who launched a book about Fannet, and it ties in with that famine era last weekend. So it's a big plus for Fannet, and to congratulate her and the people of Fannet for this lovely, wonderful book that was launched there last weekend.
And I think I see a picture of you in the paper at that event, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Have a lovely day, Joe. That's Dr. Joe Kelly, historian there.